inheriting a mountain of debt, or selling her father's 80 acres of dead sand for pennies. The bank gave her no other options. She chose to keep the dirt, earning the reputation of a fool. 3 years later, those same skeptics stood at her gate, waiting in line to beg for a share of her harvest. The wind in Thornhaven County didn't blow, it scraped. It carried a fine, biting grit that stripped the paint off barns and settled in the creases of your knuckles. Nora stood on the edge of the back porch, watching a dust devil twist across what used to be the lower pasture. It was a pale, anemic brown. 80 acres of it. Her father, Arthur, had spent 40 years trying to force this land to be something it wasn't. He had dumped synthetic fertilizers onto it until the soil's natural biology was sterilized. He had tilled it until the structure collapsed into powder. Then, the rains stopped coming. When Arthur died 3 weeks ago, his heart finally giving out in the cab of a rusted John Deere, he didn't leave a farm. He left a beach without an ocean. Nora stepped off the porch. Her boots sank an inch into the loose topsoil. She bent down, grabbed a handful of dirt, and squeezed. Good soil holds its shape. It smells like damp roots and life. The dirt in Nora's hand simply slipped through her fingers like sugar, blowing away before it even hit her boots. There was nothing left to hold the earth together. No roots, no moisture. Just sand and a crushing silence. Back inside the farmhouse, the air was thick with the smell of stale Folgers and Old Spice. The kitchen table was buried under a landslide of manila envelopes, foreclosure warnings, past due equipment loans. The local bank, managed by a man named Thomas, who had known Nora since she was in pigtails, had given her 30 days to liquidate. The offer on the table was from a corporate solar company. They wanted the acreage for panels. They were offering just enough to clear Arthur's debt and leave Nora with enough gas money to drive out of state. She sat at the table and pushed a pile of red-inked statements aside. Underneath lay a thick, dog-eared magazine. It was a seed catalogue. The cover was torn and the pages were warped from coffee spills and humidity. Arthur must have spent his final evening staring at it. Nora opened it to a random page. Heirloom Brandywine tomatoes. The picture showed a fruit so red and heavy it looked like a beating heart. Next to it, Arthur had scribbled in his jagged handwriting, "Maybe next spring." Nora stared at the ink. It was a stupid, stubborn delusion. You couldn't grow brandywines in sand. You couldn't grow anything in Thornhaven anymore. Half the county was on food stamps, and the other half was working at the Amazon Fulfillment Center, 2 towns over. Farming here was a ghost story. She closed the catalogue and reached for the pen to sign the solar company's contract. But her hand stopped. She looked at the empty chair across the table. She looked at the scuff marks on the linoleum where her father used to kick off his boots. The anger flared first, a hot, tight knot in her chest. He had ruined himself for this dirt. He had died for it. Handing it over to be paved in glass and steel felt like an erasure of his entire existence. Nora didn't sign the paper. Instead, she shoved it into a drawer, grabbed the catalogue, and walked out to the barn. Her first mistake was trying to do things his way. The bank hadn't repossessed the tractor yet. It was a massive, diesel-guzzling beast that shuddered when she turned the key. Nora hitched the disc harrow to the back, fueled by a cocktail of grief and naive determination. She had found a few bags of conventional dent corn in the shed, treated seeds, coated in bright pink fungicides. She spent 3 days tearing up the 80 acres. The noise of the engine drowned out her thoughts. The vibration numbed her hands. She cut deep into the sand, turning it over, trying to find some dark, hidden layer of moisture. There wasn't any. It was dry all the way down to the hard pan. She planted the corn. She set up the ancient irrigation pivots, praying the property's failing well would hold out. For 2 days, the sprinklers spat a weak, sputtering mist over the loose dirt. On the 4th day, the wind came. It wasn't a storm, just a steady, relentless pressure from the west. Nora stood at the kitchen window and watched the disaster unfold. The tilling had loosened whatever fragile crust the land had left. The wind picked up the sand in heavy, blinding sheets. It scoured the fields. When the wind finally died down 48 hours later, Nora walked out into the silence. The furrows were gone. The land was perfectly flat, smoothed over like a freshly made bed. She dug her fingers into the dirt, searching for the pink seeds. She found nothing. The wind had blown the top layer of sand right off the property, taking the seeds, the expensive municipal water, and her father's last bags of corn straight into the neighbor's drainage ditch. Nora dropped to her knees, the grit ground into her denim jeans. She didn't cry. Crying required moisture, and she felt as dry and hollowed out as the ground beneath her. She had rushed in, fighting the land with brute force, and the land had simply shrugged her off. It was over. The 30 days were ticking down. She had no seeds, a dry well, and 80 acres of cat litter. Nora didn't go back into the house immediately. She stayed on her knees in the dirt. She took a rusted trowel from her back pocket and started digging. The top 4 inches were loose sand. Below that, her trowel hit something solid. It felt like concrete. She scraped away the loose dirt to reveal a pale, impenetrable layer of earth. The hard pan. Decades of heavy tractors rolling over the same paths, combined with chemical salts, had compacted the subsoil into a rock-hard barrier. Even if her seeds had survived the wind, their roots would have hit this wall and snapped. Water couldn't penetrate it. It just pooled on top and evaporated. She wasn't just fighting a drought. She was fighting 40 years of abuse. That night, Nora didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table under the harsh glare of a single overhead bulb. The seed catalogue was open, but she wasn't looking at the brandywines or the sweet corn anymore. She was looking at the back pages, the weird stuff, the crops nobody in Thornhaven planted. She read about taproots that could punch through compacted clay. She read about ancient, drought-tolerant varieties cultivated by the Hopi and the Tohono O'odham in the middle of the desert. She stopped looking for things that needed deep, rich soil and started looking for things that thrived in the wasteland. The next morning, Nora drove her father's beat-up Ford to the county feed and hardware store. The bell above the door jingled. The store smelled of alfalfa, rubber tires, and fertilizer. Dean, the owner, was leaning against the counter. He was a man made of sharp angles and grey stubble. He looked up, his expression a mix of pity and exasperation. "I thought you'd be packing, Nora," Dean said, not unkindly. "Thomas over at the bank says you haven't returned his calls." "I need seeds, Dean," Nora said, walking up to the counter. She pulled out a list. "But not the usual." Dean squinted at her scribbles. "Daikon radish? Tepary beans? Sorghum? What the hell is this, Nora? We're a corn and soy county. Nobody grows this stuff. And radishes? It's the wrong season. They won't make a cash crop. I don't need them for cash. I need them to break the ground." Nora leaned forward. "The radishes have tap roots that can grow 2 feet long. They'll drill through the hard pan. When they die, they rot and leave tunnels for water to get down. The Tepary beans are desert natives. They fix nitrogen in the sand. And the sorghum will grow tall enough to act as a windbreak, so my topsoil doesn't end up in your parking lot." Dean stared at her for a long, quiet moment. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Nora, listen to me. Your dad was a good man. but he chased the yield until it killed him. The soil is dead. You can't grow pride out of sand. Take the solar company's check. Can you order them or not, Dean? He saw the set of her jaw. It was Arthur's jaw. I can get the sorghum and the radishes from a supplier in Nebraska. The beans you'll have to source yourself. Give me 3 days. Nora went home and parked the tractor in the barn. She threw a tarp over it. She wouldn't be tilling again. When the seeds arrived, she didn't broadcast them over the whole 80 acres. She couldn't. She had to start small. She marked out a single half-acre plot right behind the house, where the wind was broken slightly by the rusted silhouette of a grain silo. Planting was agonizing. Without the tractor, she used a hand-pushed wheel seeder for the radishes and walked the rows, poking holes in the sand with a sharpened broom handle for the beans and sorghum. The sun beat down on the back of her neck, a heavy, physical weight. Her lower back screamed. Blisters bloomed on her palms, popped, and filled with dirt, turning into angry, raw sores. She hauled water by hand. The well was too weak to run the pivots without sucking air, so she filled 5-gallon buckets from the house spigot, carried them out, and poured a single cup of water onto each planted seed. It took her hours. She did it at dawn, and she did it at dusk. Her neighbors drove past the property on the county road. They slowed down, watching the lone woman carrying buckets across a patch of barren sand. She knew what they were saying. Arthur's girl finally lost her mind. 2 weeks passed. Nothing happened. Nora's arms ached so deeply she couldn't lift a coffee cup without trembling. The bank sent another letter, this one printed on heavier, more urgent paper. Thomas left a voicemail saying he had to send the sheriff for the equipment by Friday. On Thursday evening, Nora walked out to the half-acre. The air was still hot, radiating off the sand. She dropped her empty buckets and crouched down, her knees popping. She stared at the spot where she had buried a tippery bean. There, pushing up through the pale, granular dirt, was a speck of green. It was tiny. A fragile, pale stalk curled like a baby's finger, lifting a grain of sand out of its way. Nora stopped breathing. She crawled a few feet to the left. Another green shoot. She looked down the row. They were there, dozens of them, microscopic against the vastness of the dead acreage, but unmistakably alive. The desert beans had recognized the heat and the dry earth, and they had awakened. She walked over to the radish rows. The tough little brassicas were already pushing out their first true leaves, digging their sharp roots downward, beginning the invisible, violent work of shattering the hardpan. Nora sat down in the dirt. She didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She just ran her calloused, blistered thumb over the edge of a green leaf. It was a brutal, cynical world. The bank was coming. The wind would return. The sun would try to scorch these plants into ash. But for the first time in 40 years, the land wasn't blowing away. It was holding on. And so was she. Sheriff Miller pulled into the driveway at 9 o'clock on Friday morning. He drove a county cruiser that groaned over the ruts, kicking up the same pale dust Nora was fighting to keep on the ground. He stepped out, a man built like a cinder block, thumbing his utility belt. He didn't want to be here. He had played high school football with Arthur. Foreclosing on ghosts was a dirty job. Nora met him on the porch. She had a mug of black coffee in her hand. Her knuckles were wrapped in white athletic tape to cover the burst blisters. She looked at the sheriff, feeling none of the panic she had expected. "Morning, Nora," Miller said, looking everywhere but at her eyes. He stared at the dry, rotted wood of the porch railing. "Thomas from the bank sent me. The tractor. The disc harrow. He says the paperwork went through on Wednesday. Keys are in the ignition, Miller," she said. Her voice was flat, detached. "Barn doors are unlatched. You can back the flatbed right up to it." Miller frowned, finally looking up. You're not fighting it. You're not going to yell at me? Arthur would have met me out here with a 12-gauge and a lot of strong language. Arthur is dead, and that machine killed this land. Nora took a sip of coffee. Take it. I don't need it. She stood on the porch and watched them load the massive green beast onto a flatbed. As the diesel engine fired up one last time, blowing a plume of black soot into the clear morning air, Nora felt a physical weight lift from her chest. The debt was bleeding out of her life. Without the tractor, there was no temptation to till. She was committed to the slow, invisible, grueling labor of the dirt. Winter hit Thornhaven hard that year. The frost arrived in early November, plunging the county into a deep, brittle freeze. For most farmers, winter was a season of idle waiting, sitting in warm kitchens, repairing machinery, and complaining about commodity prices. For Nora's half-acre, winter was the executioner. The thick green leaves of the daikon radishes turned black and wilted. The sorghum stalks snapped in the freezing winds. By December, the plot looked like a graveyard. Her neighbor, Carl Jenkins, who farmed 2,000 acres of genetically modified soy 3 miles down the road, drove by in his heated pickup. He saw the rotting vegetation, rolled down his window, and laughed. He told Dean at the hardware store that Arthur's girl was growing weeds and letting them die in the frost. Carl didn't understand what was happening underground. As the frost killed the radishes, their massive 2-foot-long taproots, thick as baseball bats, remained lodged in the earth. As they began to decay, they became organic sponges. The rotting flesh of the radishes held on to the winter moisture, preventing it from evaporating into the cold, dry air. More importantly, as they shriveled, they left behind deep, perfectly round channels in the concrete-like hardpan. Nature's plough had broken the seal. When the spring thaw arrived in March, the magic happened. For the first time in a generation, the snowmelt didn't run off Nora's property into the county drainage ditches. It hit the half-acre, found the holes left by the radishes, and drained deep into the subsoil. Nora walked out onto the plot on the first warm day of April. The smell of decay was pungent, a sour, earthy musk that made her eyes water. It was the stench of death. But to Nora, it was the perfume of life. She knelt and dug her fingers into the earth. It wasn't loose sand anymore. The decaying plant matter had started to bind the grit together. It stained her fingers a pale, greyish brown. It was the first breath of humus. She dug a few inches deeper. Then she stopped, curled around a piece of rotting radish root, sluggish from the lingering cold, was an earthworm. A single, pale, pink earthworm. Nora stared at it for 10 solid minutes. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't blink. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The biology was returning. The microscopic bacteria and fungi had feasted on the roots, and now the larger creatures were coming to feast on the fungi. Life was clawing its way back into the 80 acres, but half an acre wouldn't pay the property taxes. She needed scale. She had kept the solar company at bay by making a single, minimal payment, using money she scraped together by selling Arthur's antique pocket watch and a collection of hunting rifles. The bank was circling, waiting for her to stumble. Year 2 was a brutal expansion. She moved from half an acre to 5 acres. Since she had no tractor, she bought a heavy-duty, 2-wheel walk-behind tiller off a local mechanic. It didn't churn the soil, it just sliced a narrow slit into the ground, barely disturbing the structure. She planted a complex polyculture. She didn't plant neat, uniform rows of a single crop. She mimicked a forest floor. She planted cowpeas to fix more nitrogen. She planted deep-rooted sunflowers to draw up calcium from deep within the earth. And in the center of the 5 acres, she planted the 3 sisters: corn, climbing beans, and squash. The corn provided a trellis for the beans. The beans fed the corn nitrogen. The massive leaves of the squash spread across the ground, shading the soil from the blistering summer sun and preventing weeds. Then, the drought of year 2 set in. It didn't rain for 45 days. The Thornhaven County Reservoir dropped to historically low levels. The municipal water district cut off agricultural irrigation. Carl Jenkins watched his 2,000 acres of soy turn yellow, then brown, then crumble into dust. His shallow tilled fields, completely exposed to the sun, baked into a hard ceramic crust. Nora walked through her 5 acres in the middle of July. The ambient temperature was 98 degrees. The heat waves distorted the horizon. But when she stepped under the towering stalks of her sunflowers and corn, the temperature dropped by 10 degrees. The broad squash leaves acted like a living tarp. She slid her hand under a spiky green squash leaf and touched the earth. It was damp. The deep channels from her radishes had banked the winter snowmelt deep underground. The taproots of her current crops were drinking from reserves that the industrial farmers couldn't reach. While the rest of the county was turning into a brown husk, Nora's 5 acres were a pulsing dark green oasis. Dean drove out from the hardware store one Sunday. He parked on the road and leaned against his truck, staring at the 5-foot sunflowers waving in the hot wind. Nora walked out to meet him, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of a dirt-caked hand. "I'll be damned," Dean muttered, taking off his cap and scratching his head. "Carl Jenkins is in town crying over a beer about the weather, and you're growing a jungle out here." "It's not the weather, Dean," Nora said, handing him a perfectly ripe, dark green zucchini the size of his forearm. "It's the soil. The weather is just the test." By the spring of year 3, the tipping point arrived. Nora had expanded her operation to 40 acres. She hadn't done it alone. Word had quietly spread through the county's bruised underbelly. A couple of high school kids looking for summer work, a retired mechanic who missed the smell of diesel but hated the chemical sprays, a former nurse who just wanted to touch dirt. They started showing up at her gate. She couldn't pay them much, mostly minimum wage and all the vegetables they could carry, but they stayed. They stayed because working Nora's fields didn't feel like working a factory floor. It felt like participating in a resurrection. The soil had changed completely. It was no longer sand. It was a rich, loamy brown that smelled like a forest after a thunderstorm. The earthworms were so thick you couldn't dig a trowel in without unearthing a dozen. The water table beneath her property, protected by the sponge-like earth, had stabilized, and she finally planted the brandywines. She dedicated a full 2 acres to heirloom tomatoes. Not the hard, tasteless red plastic orbs grown for cross-country shipping, but the ugly, lopsided, profoundly sweet varieties her father had stared at in his final days. They grew heavy and thick, weighing down the trellis lines, splitting the air with the sharp, green scent of tomato vines. It was late August when the regional supply chain finally buckled. A combination of a severe diesel shortage, a rail strike, and a catastrophic drought in the western states crippled the grocery stores. The mega-farms that supplied Thornhaven with 90% of its food simply stopped shipping. The shelves at the local supermarket, managed by an anxious man named Greg, emptied out in 3 days. Panic buying stripped the produce aisles down to the bare linoleum. Thornhaven was an agricultural county, but nobody grew food. They grew commodities. Soy for feedlots, corn for ethanol. You couldn't eat a raw ear of field corn without breaking a tooth. The county was starving in the middle of 10,000 acres of farmland. On a Tuesday morning, Nora loaded up her rusted Ford pickup. The bed was piled high with wooden crates. She had bell peppers that looked like polished jade. She had yellow squash, deep purple eggplants, sweet corn, and hundreds of pounds of brandywine tomatoes, their skins tight and bursting with juice. She drove into town and parked right in the middle of the town square, directly across from the bank. She dropped the tailgate. She didn't put up a sign. She just stood there in her worn boots and faded flannel, waiting. The first person to approach was Sarah, a woman who worked at the diner. She looked at the tomatoes with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Where did you get these?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Grew 'em," Nora said, "out on Arthur's place." "Arthur's place? That's nothing but dead sand." "Not anymore. Sarah bought 10 pounds. Within an hour, a line had formed. It snaked past the empty supermarket and wrapped around the block. People who had sneered at Nora's buckets, people who had laughed at her rotting weeds, were now standing in the blistering sun, clutching crumpled cash. Nora didn't gouge them. She sold the food at a fair cost. For the families she knew were struggling, the families whose factory shifts had been cut, she simply handed over the crates and told them to pay her back in winter. By noon, the truck was half empty. That was when Thomas walked out of the bank. He was wearing a crisp white shirt, but he looked older, more tired than Nora remembered. He crossed the street, the sun glinting off his silver watch. He stopped at the tailgate, looking at a crate of massive ribbed brandy wines. He didn't look at Nora right away. He picked up a tomato. The weight of it, the heat radiating from its skin, was undeniable. It was real. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It wasn't a foreclosure notice. "I had the paperwork drawn up 3 times, Nora," Thomas said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. "I almost filed it last spring. I thought I was doing you a favor. I thought I was saving you from dying out there like your dad." Nora wiped a smear of dirt from her cheek. "You can't save people from the dirt, Thomas. You just have to learn how to live with it." Thomas nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill. "Can I get a few of these? My wife, she hasn't had a real tomato since she was a little girl." "Take a whole box," Nora said. She didn't take his money. "Consider it a down payment on my mortgage. I'll be in on Friday to settle up the year." Thomas smiled, a genuine, fractured smile. He took the box and walked back to the bank. Nora watched him go. The line of people moved forward. She handed out squash, bagged up beans, and talked about the weather. For the first time in her life, the wind blowing through Thornhaven didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a messenger. It carried the smell of rain, the scent of damp earth, and the undeniable truth that the land was finally breathing again. She had taken 80 acres of dust and built a sanctuary, not by fighting the earth, but by finally listening to it. The earth owes us nothing, but it gives everything to those willing to listen. Nora took 80 acres of dead sand and turned it into a lifeline, proving that the deepest roots grow during the hardest times. Have you ever had to start over from absolute zero and rebuild your life? Drop your story in the comments below. If Nora's gritty journey struck a chord, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more real stories of human survival.